Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 14th India Policy Forum. It's a great pleasure to have you all here, and thank you for those who have come from long distances, as well as those who are here in New Delhi or in the rest of India. It's always a privilege to be here, and I'm just thrilled that this opening session, we've also had the good fortune of persuading Arvind Subramanian, Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, to be with us. Arvind has a very tight schedule, so we're only about 6 minutes late, so hopefully we'll be able to conclude. He has to release his Economic Survey Volume 2 this week, and as anybody who's dealt with data and innumerable tables knows, that's an arduous task. We have a great program, I think. I always worry when I use the word great now because of the other person in the world who uses that all the time. So we have a good program this year. There's a little program, little thing that you can put in your pocket that has all the details. The one salient change that I want to mention is that the India Policy Forum lecture is not today as it normally has been in the past, but it's tomorrow, Lant Pritchett at 7 o'clock, not here at the Imperial Hotel. So after the sessions end tomorrow, there will be transport for those who wish to use it to go to the Imperial Hotel in the late afternoon, early evening. The India Policy Forum was started by my predecessor, Suman Berry, who is very much here in the audience. And it started as a way for us to be fostering work on India, empirical work on India, original empirical work, and then have it published in its own forum, which was the journal that came out every year, loosely patterned after the Brookings Papers of Economic Activity, and indeed a partnership for the first decade with the Brookings Institution in Washington. That partnership ended about 4 years back, once Brookings established its own beachhead here in Delhi. But we seem to be going from strength to strength with every year throwing up new ideas and new interesting topics. There's a wide variety of topics, as always, in the IPF, and we're going to start with air pollution and end with urban city growth. So that kind of covers the whole gamut of things in between. Very interestingly, we've added a new session at post-lunch tomorrow, which is looking back at these 5 IPF papers and the Financial Inclusion Policy Roundtable. And the idea is to think about market failure versus government failure in India, and what messages we get from the IPF papers, each of which either directly or tangentially addresses that question. So we'll have a chance to reflect back on these papers as well. I won't take more of your time. I just want to say that I'm eternally grateful to Karthik Muralidharan, my co-editor of the India Policy Forum, for the amazing work he does, apart from everything else he does, and to Barry Bosworth, who's not here. Barry, as all of you know, is at Brookings, but was unable to join us this year. And they've been incredible sources of support over the years. The Endeavour enterprise started with Arvind Panagaria and Barry Bosworth and Suman Berry. And it's great to have Barry with us as one of the first founder members of this enterprise. With that, let me just turn to Arvind, and then after Arvind, I'll ask Karthik to just wind up this opening session. Arvind?
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here, and it's really a wonderful cast of I would say characters, forgive my saying so, correct, and wonderful, schedule of papers and topics. So I'm only standing in the way of that exciting program. I've been asked to speak about, research topics. So there's some underlying notion that, I'm in government needs work done, there are ideas out there. I have some sense of what those should be. I should transmit it to you. You will go off and do this fabulous research, come back, and then, it will in turn have an impact, and India will change and the lives of people will change. I mean, that's kind of the model of, underlying this, I suspect. I'm, of course, caricaturing, exaggerating, being a bit sarcastic, but it's something like that. I'm not going to do anything of that sort. See, I think all of you know better than I what topics, have to be covered and what shouldn't and so on. But maybe if there's a Q&A, we can talk about topics. So I want to talk less about topics than, broader issues of, what's useful, how of the process rather than necessarily the what of the process itself. I want to begin by saying that, of course, I am a really big believer in, ideas, facts, analysis, etc. In fact, I'm fairly manic. I follow as much as I can, all the research that's being done. I follow Shanta, I follow Ideas for India blogs just to keep a sense. I follow the NBR thing. So I try and keep abreast of obviously not at all successfully, but I try my best. And of course, if there's missing anything, Karthik will not fail to bombard me with his latest work. So it's you can't escape Karthik, but it's wonderful to have all this research material to digest. I want to make 2-3 controversial propositions to begin with, and then let's discuss them. And I'm this is sharing my personal experience. I mean, it needn't be true in other contexts for other people, but in my limited time in government, I found that what I have found most useful are simple facts, simple analysis, basic, number crunching, and I've not exactly had to rely on really sophisticated research, just to take a jibe at a randomista who's sitting next to me. I cannot say that I've had to, had a lot of use of really sophisticated research to try and move the needle domestically. Now, I'll just give you examples from yesterday or even the last 2 days. We got hold of this amazing data on Aadhaar, and again a very big data set, and we found something very interesting, and we presented it to the people, some of the people who are involved in this issue, and it was actually extremely interesting, and I think the consumers found it reasonably useful. Similarly, yesterday when the GST is being implemented, I heard, for example, from my brother, who happens to be also a former revenue service officer, that there were 3 lakh new registrants under the GST. That kind of got me salivating at the prospect of, wow, what does this mean? And very quickly, thanks to help from the finance minister and others, we asked the CBDT people to give us data of sales and purchases of these new registrants to see potentially what could be the increase in the tax base from the GST. Now, for me, I think these are really important and pressing issues. They require, of course, access to data. They require, careful analysis. But at that point, at least of course, there's a lot more you can do with this data. But that's the kind of thing which, on an ongoing basis, that I need, and I'm sure it's true for the others. And that's the kind of stuff I am looking for. So there's a very famous phrase attributed to Karthik, which I'm going to adapt. I'm going to say that proposition number 1 is that the intersection of relevance, rigor, and timeliness of the work that you do is that set is probably much smaller for a policy maker than it is from an academic perspective. Let me make a slightly more controversial proposition that the intersection of these 3 things from a policy maker's perspective is probably close to 0. And I think you in academia need to be, see, again, I'm not coming here to preach to anyone. All of you do your stuff because you know what's important. You know what drives you and motivates you. But I just feel that we should be clear that there are no illusions about this. That that some of the stuff is going to be used in a timely manner and so on. Because frankly, I mean, let's be honest. You write down these models of agents who react to incentives, but of course the irony is that the guy who's writing the model himself responds to all these incentives that you face. And those incentives, include having to be very rigorous, having to publish, in top academic journals. But I mean, I don't think that that's what we are necessarily looking for in the perspective that, or in the time frames that we operate in here. And again, this is not meant to be, throwing stones, or this is just my own experience. May be wrong, but I do want to give you a context to my experience. I think that there are 4 or 5 reasons why I think what I've said I strongly believe in. One is that I think a flip side of backwardness, the advantages of backwardness, as it were, Gershon-Cron advantage, is that there are so many low-hanging fruit that it doesn't take rocket science to kind of establish that fertilizer subsidies are bad and this is the way to remove them. So that's one reason why I think I say what I do. The second reason is, of course, what I think Solo says. We're all basically intellectual sanitation workers, that maybe 90% of our job is just to flush out bad ideas. And I think I'm being honest, say very true. I mean, I cannot tell you how basic things get. I mean, this year, as in other years, we've had budget discussions, at the highest level, where I'm struggling to just say, look at real increases and not nominal increases. Often that's the level at which you have to be able to operate. Then I think the other thing, of course, is that I deal a lot in macro and macro development issues, and I think maybe there, it's probably more difficult to have this kind of rigorous, kind of stuff that all of you do. And so, from a macro point of view, the things that we need are perhaps not as amenable to the things that you do in terms of, randomization or sophisticated analysis. But maybe that's another reason why I say what I do. Then, of course, there's the time frame issue. I honestly get calls saying, tell me about this 2 days later. So just to give you one example, fertilizer subsidy, there's a DBT project going on. We need to know how it's doing. And, I don't need a randomized evaluation for it to take it to the next step. I need to know, did they look at the main things? For example, the first phase of the study was done off-peak season. So it's completely useless in that sense, right? I mean, because we know, can DBT respond when actually the demand for fertilizer is high? Is the system working there or not? So I think that we need things done carefully, obviously. I mean, but we don't need it done in a way that has to respond to policy. So I think that's another reason. And finally, I think again, I haven't been in government in other governments. Maybe there's something peculiar about this government as well that kind of prompts me to say what I do. Maybe when Montague was in the Planning Commission, all of you could come and present your research over 10, 15 years, and and maybe it was a more maybe the attitude of that government maybe was a bit different, and so that's also possible. So in that sense, there's no reason why you should take my thing as having generalized applicability to everything. On a personal note, I would add that as I said, I'm a big believer in ideas, but I think that there is, I guess, there's an obvious but very important distinction between, being a terrific economist and being a reasonably influential policy economist. I absolutely swear by what Keynes said what are the requirements? Keynes, the famous puzzle of it's pretty easy to be to do technical economics. It's not rocket science, and yet he said, why is it more difficult to find good economists compared to whatever good mathematicians or whatever? And then his answer, of course, and he was saying this about Marshall, but actually he was saying this about himself, that you have to know symbols, words, this, that, or the other. You basically have to know a lot, because one of the things I think he missed was, and it's very ironic, I think to have a sense, to be influential in policy, I do think you need to understand the actors involved and how their minds tick and what kind of data and analysis will appeal to them, as opposed to. So in that sense, I think that it's so multidimensional that So economics as an academic profession is, whatever, like plumbing, engineering, whatever. It has its own rules, frameworks, discourse, accountability mechanisms, and at one level, why not? It's like other things, but it's when we want to have this bigger, wider impact. Then I think the incentives, the frameworks, everything change, and ought to change if I think you want to have an impact and be relevant and so on. Now, I've rambled on. Let me make 2 or 3 more constructive suggestions. I think that, my own experience is that if you want to be, even get a sense of what needs to be done, how to get data, which often may not be easy. I think it's terribly important for, all of you who do such good work, I think, to be integrated into this and have a lot of personal relationships and networks. Take data, for example. Maybe it's true that, this government or this country doesn't put out as much e-data as other countries do. And even within government, it's not always easy to get data. But I can tell you that in my 3 years here, the amount of data, new data that I have actually had access to, and you'll see it in the survey, the railway data, the tax, every GSTN transaction, every Aadhaar transaction, the kind of access that we have. But it is only through informal contacts that you get it. I mean, the notion that somehow government will put it up and it'll be there for all of you to get it, I think it's not going to happen, for right or wrong. You just have to accept that. But I think that the way around this is to establish, much more, close personal networks as well. And that applies also to, I think, the topics that you want to do for research. See, I've often felt in my 2-3 years, there have been innumerable occasions when I've wanted to pick up the phone and say, I don't know, Rohini, Dilip, Karthik, I have this problem, can you give me an answer in, 2 days, and things. But I wish those kinds of networks would exist. Because I would find it very useful. I know it may not be very useful for all of you, but I think that is what I think, and that would also be a way of, talking about what needs to be done, etc., etc. So I think, please do not underestimate the role of informal things in data, in what topics that need to be done, and so on. Last point I would say in terms of this, part of being relevant to what's happening in India. And this is something I've discovered, I've been surprised by and discovered over the last 2 to 3 years, is I think there's a huge gap in terms of, obviously capacity and the need for mentorship. I head formally the Indian Economic Service. I have to, rely on and deal with members of the economic service, and especially at lower junior levels. I mean, they're very bright, enthusiastic and things, but their training and exposure has been fairly limited. So if all of you think of think of being relevant, there's a kind of research component to what you do, but I think there's also kind of mentorship component to potentially. Again, I don't mean to preach. I mean, take it or leave it. There's a kind of mentorship component to what you can do to have a huge impact on India. And the thought crossed my mind this morning, and I don't know how many of you would take it up, is that I would, for example, love, say, 10 of my brightest IAS officers to be attached to one of you or your colleagues for 6 months. And they should be able to pick up the phone and say, Rohini, should I do month-on-month growth rates or year-on-year growth rates? Because, 2 days ago, I got something where, the person got it completely wrong and had no clue what he or she was doing. Should I include district year or district month fixed effects in a regression? So I think that's extremely, part of the reason I did this MOOC, which, we spent a lot of time doing, is the sense that I had was, there are all these students out there, very curious, very intelligent, whatever, but completely underserved by the system. The quality of teaching is bad, the exposure to the latest things is non-existent. So, how do you reach out to kind of all those, so many students out there, and actually make a difference to their lives, improve their human skills and capacity. So I think that mentorship part of it is something also I would submit would be something that I think it would be great if all of you could, to see that as part of this whole agenda of being, relevant, influential, impactful, which all of us, are striving for in our own ways. And I think that would be extremely useful as well. So, I've sounded preachy. My apologies for doing so. I've not given you any particular topics to do. My apologies for doing so. But I just wanted to share, I think, what I really have felt. Because I do think that, this whole mentorship, skill building capacity, and and Shekhar, you've been kind of also involved in this, is terribly important if you want to change, bring about change in India. And I think building personal relationships, I think, is also extremely I found that's the way it works even within government. So in the interaction between you and government and others in government, I suspect that would be very important too. We can talk about UBI and all the mistakes that the economic survey made, over tea. We can talk about, what exciting research there is to be done on demonetization, on the GST, on employment. But I didn't think it'd be particularly useful to run through a litany of, things that probably much more than I do. But I just wanted to share these kind of broader thoughts with you. So thank you, and sorry for sounding a bit preachy.
Karthik, do you want to?
15 minutes? Take this question.
Yeah,
question.
Yeah, I'll try to not take more than 5 minutes. I had no idea what Arvind was going to talk about, so this is kind of comments on the fly. So I think, one thing that occurred to me hearing Arvind was this was a version of a very old debate in development of appropriate technology, right? It means going back to the 50s and 60s that, and the same thing applied to research, that you've got the cutting edge of research methodology, which may not quite be the appropriate technology for the problems that you're trying to solve, which is quick and dirty facts. That being said, I think, I've said this before, and I'm glad you kind of attributed that back, because we've all been struggling with this demand for evidence-driven policy, demand for demand-driven evidence, and the problem is that the timelines just don't line up, right? The timelines for what is good quality academic work is completely different, from the timelines for what the policymaker wants. And we should not try to force the two to be the same. There is a reason why academic timeframes are longer. I think we all have roles in society, and the academic role is to get it right rather than get it fast. That's why you cloister us in universities and kind of, keep us away, to get it right. And so that being said, so I don't think the answer to this question is to say somehow compress the academic time frame. It's more saying recognize that there are these two competing worlds, and what are the missing markets, that an entity like IPF can solve. And so I think that's kind of broadly what we are trying to do, which is saying that, these two worlds exist. And so our goal, I think in the earlier incarnations of the IPF, I think the goals included providing outlets for local researchers to publish work, that was locally relevant. But I think increasingly high quality primary research, everybody wants to publish in international peer reviewed journals, and we don't expect that we're going to get the best primary research. Rather, I think the goal of IPF really is to provide, that synthesis of high quality primary research, so that when you have your 2-minute call, your 2-day turnover, we can at least provide a 6-month turnaround, which is to say, here's been 15 years of work on education, on 10 years on NREGS, tons of work on environment and pollution, work on agriculture extension, and can we get leading scholars to spend a little bit of time synthesizing a body of evidence so that when there is in fact a policy window, that we have a ready resource available. And I think so I agree with Arvind that you don't personally need the AER article to convince the finance minister to do something, but that's because they rely on you to synthesize that evidence and kind of assume somehow that the technocrats within government have kind of curated the quality of evidence to come up with an informed view. And so to the extent that even 1 degree of separation away, the quality matters. I think the hope here is to give you the confidence that whatever is an IPF paper has been curated through a certain amount of quality filters, that what you're seeing there gives that you feel confident taking that to policy. The second kind of IPF paper, which I think is incredibly valuable, which we're starting to see more of, are just papers with high quality facts. So these are papers that wouldn't get published in the AER, but are incredibly important. And so, I remember Tarun's paper from last year, which was just a simple descriptive narrative of the Indian household and debt survey. And just knowing, for example, that the median household has no financial assets helps you completely think differently about things like land acquisition, right? That what does it mean to take away a tangible asset and put something in a bank account, and why that's a political non-starter. And that's the sort of thing that you wouldn't see till you saw just that simple distribution of assets that you got from that. There's a paper this time from Neelkant and colleagues, which I'm incredibly excited about, which is just putting together facts on state budgets. This is incredibly important. Not enough people are doing this. The Accountability Initiative spent 3 years just trying to put together education expenditure, aggregating center and state budgets. And so the fact that Neelkant's team has done this enormous amount of work putting together those facts means that that is, again, the sort of thing that I think would be incredibly relevant and useful, right? In the policy world. So I think I don't have much more to say beyond saying that, we agree. I think the goal here is to have a forum that solves some of these missing markets. And I think hopefully 2 things that we can do better. One, and we would really welcome your support in this, is as we plan next year's IPF, is to sit and spend 15 minutes or half an hour saying what are the questions on which you would most value this kind of synthesis, so that we can keep that in mind as we commission the next round of papers. And the second is in terms of just building awareness that these syntheses exist. We've talked multiple times about how the action of many reforms is at the state and not at the center, and how it's kind of criminal in my mind that we don't have a chief economic advisor for every state. Each state is bigger than most countries. And so thinking about creating fora whereby these inputs and insights that typically tend to be very Delhi-centric are kind of made more accessible to states, and even just build awareness that these things exist, I think would be 2 relatively low-hanging pieces of fruit, by which to push this conversation forward. So let me start.
So let me open it up to questions from the floor, since we still have a few more minutes with Arvind. I see Tarun's flag up. Anybody else? Rohini? So Tarun?
This has been an interesting conversation. I guess my question is that in the US, they have the Council of Economic Advisors that performs this function. Economists take sabbatical for a year, go and spend some time in government. Rather than having your students or the people who are working with you go out to other places, maybe another possibility is to have a forum where economists can come and spend a year, have access to interesting data sets, do some policy work, learn a little bit about the messy business of doing policy, and then potentially even have things to publish at the end of it, so it's also incentive compatible for them.
Rohini? Just collect a few. Microphone, please, we can't hear you.
Last year there was a paper, I think it was Sandeep, on the NREGS, and Amarjeet was there talking about his take on it. And what was interesting to me was that it's not just timeline, so all the work in economics has looked at wage effects of different kinds. And so Amarjeet's point was, you haven't looked at assets at all, which is fundamental to the act. So it's not just timelines, it's a matter of looking at what the legislation is really about, what was its goals, why did it come into place, and then actually highlighting the fact that we're just looking at one little component of it. And that gets hidden sometimes, because when someone looks at all this research, people don't even realize, if they haven't gone back to the Act, that the main point was these rural assets. So just to say that it's not just timelines where there is a tension, but there are these other things which you don't look at because you really don't have data easily available, and you don't, sort of even think of doing it.
Just two things. One, on your point, Tarun, I think that what I found phenomenally valuable is having youngsters who've worked with me over the last 3 years. They've been just, and it's been phenomenally useful for me, but also their interaction with the Indian Economic Service, the people who work with me, that two-way interaction has been, I think, phenomenally successful. And I agree, we do need more of that. I think, Niti, I think, offers some possibilities. I mean, I would actually like that to happen in every ministry. In the old days, we used to have, an office of economic advisor, and outsiders used to come, and you used to have very illustrious people there. And then I think we could have more, because I certainly think that not just in finance, but apart from the states, but in all the ministries. But my mentoring idea was not, going abroad 6 months, but in situ. I mean, could they be here and say, Google chat with you in terms of, they're working on the national situation, household debt situation, they have this problem, and get leads. So I think that would be something very useful. On Rohini's point, I think it's a very good point. A year and a half ago, or maybe 2 years ago, when before the government decided on the Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana, I mean, I was involved in some, but not all the discussions. But that stage, I really felt, I don't know this literature. Not very many people in the room know this literature well. I even tried getting in touch with Sean, and Sean was busy, and thing. But in retrospect, my anxieties about that, and making decisions without thing were kind of maybe are being realized. But that's a case where I would agree that had we had the benefit of someone come and saying this won't work, it's been tried everywhere. That I think is something that the kind of curating thing that you say could have been very useful. But those tend to happen, when kind of big decisions are taken and so on. So there's kind of a portfolio of kind of inputs that I find very useful. But when you say, Karthik, next year what we should do, kind of topics, I wish what I'm pressing for is something more ongoing rather than episodic. We come and tell you, okay, 3 topics, and you produce that then. They have a certain shelf life and a certain relevance. But could we make it more ongoing is the kind of plea that I would like to make. And Tarun's ideas are certainly relevant there as well. I mean, Rohini, take your example, Manrega. I mean, if they'd been interacting on an ongoing basis, maybe that could have come to light much earlier than having to actually wait for an IPF conference.
Actually, Tarun's idea also was that that scholars would be based in the Ministry of Finance as visitors, and would actually then have personal relationships formed with your colleagues, so that then they'd find it very easy to just pick up the phone or Google chat with a Tarun and say, I can't figure this thing out on the balance sheet. What does this mean? So I guess that's what your point was. I guess partly we also try to do that, but again, it is episodic. Every chair that you see on the program is by and large from government. The chairman of the Central Pollution Control Board will be here, and thereafter a number of other people. So that this is partly a way of interacting with this.
Can I just say one thing I forgot to mention also was, you mentioned Neelkant's work on state budgets. I have found very useful in my own thing. I mean, a lot of the private sector, kind of things that analysis that comes out, again, because it's macro, maybe because it's public finance, and maybe it's also because, these people also have a sense of the, what's relevance, what's things. So I found that actually a very useful as well. Neelkant himself was, on our GST committee. I mean, I think that the work that Credit Suisse has done on debt is just outstanding. And Ashish, someone I rely on a lot. But that kind of stuff, and let me come back to a pet peeve of mine actually, and this is where I think that about a couple of months ago I ranted about the fact that people don't speak up to power more. I mean, the outsiders, Neelkant and his colleagues would never tell you in public that monetary policy is too tight, even if they felt it was too tight. And I've always felt that kind of thing can only come from academia, academic voices here. And I found that missing. Is it something about macro that all of you shy away from because, whatever. But that is a gap that I find in this. I mean, I would love to have, one of you writing about, Taylor rules for India. How does it apply now or doesn't apply now? Is there a shift in the inflationary process in India? All these are kind of things that I grapple with just to say that the kinds of, what is really exciting is that, I do deal with in the Ministry of Finance all these issues, loan waivers, DBT, inflation, monetary policy, debt paths, etc., etc. So, I need a variety of inputs, but, some more high frequency type stuff from, all of you would actually help me a lot.
Okay. Suman, did you have a quick question? No? All right. Any? Can
No, I think this all makes a lot of sense. Let me just kind of get back to reality again, right? So when I said 6 months, 6 months is already a huge improvement over the typical academic time frame, which is 3 to 5 to 6 years, which is what it takes to write a good paper, right? So, we were trying to improve that. But I think if the 2-week turnaround, that kind of you're looking for, I think the truth is at that point, you're kind of outside academic time frames. I mean, you're really in kind of, you're in Neelkant's time frames, which is fantastic. I mean, I've been a management consultant, and the time is money. It matters, and you want the best answer you can get in 2 weeks and proceed. But I think perhaps the most practical way then of bridging that is what Tarun was talking about, which is if you have 5 people in the finance ministry who look after 5 broad, verticals, but who are serious technical economists, but who are seconded in a time in their life when they're not trying to write academic papers, but trying to do policy work. Then you can expect the 2-week turnaround. You can't expect that 2-week turnaround when people are kind of juggling their teaching and everything like that. And let me make one more plea for this relationship building. I think there seems to be an assumption in government that the relationship building has to be initiated by the academics, and it's not obvious why that needs to be the case, right? So in the sense that why can't the joint secretaries of relevant ministries, kind of come to you and saying, who are the 5 or 6 experts in the world who I need to kind of have on some kind of, short-term advisory back and call kind of council, so that we can meet once a year and we can say, here are the big issues we're grappling with. And then, if there is, in some sense, because you're the customer, right? And the customer has to reach out rather than expect that the academic who's sitting on a different time frame, different world will somehow know who the right person to talk to is. So I think, we make the assumption too much that it's, these academics in their ivory towers need to reach out more. I think most academics will reach out, will kind of give you time, if they feel that they are being engaged in a thoughtful way. I have received, invitations to attend senior cabinet or senior workshops at 1 week notice, right? It doesn't work that way, right? So whereas these things are thoughtful things that you do over 6 months, 1 year, but I do think more can be done on both sides.
Yeah, on both sides, yeah. You see, I think let's also look at it, Karthik, be practical on the other side as well. I think that, let's be honest, very few joint secretaries, will either have, that kind of knowledge or even the confidence that, the more they know that the Kartiks and the Rohinis and the Dilips and the thing are accessible, the more I think they will kind of reach out as well. So it is a two-way process. I do think that we do need more people from the outside, on a kind of a more semi-permanent basis. But I also do think that if that's not going to happen, we need much more informal networks building up as a way of,
And I particularly like the idea that you put out, Arvind, about a kind of a help desk.
Yeah.
Something that's not terribly formal, but just like any of these discussion groups or things where you just put out a query and you get 5 responses in less than a day or half a day. And these are generally credible responses with people whose names you can kind of trust. So this may be something for us to explore, and I'm sure that we can at NCAER play a role in putting together such an electronic forum. With that, let me thank Arvind for taking the time out. This was at short notice, and as I said, he's incredibly tight with his with his schedule, with his report that he has to release. Before we let him go, we're going to ask him to just launch the edition of the last conference, and so I think the photographers will probably want to take a picture.
Is this a very Indian thing where you just stand there and you hold the book like this?
It is an incredibly Indian thing. I'm not quite sure where it comes from. I guess that you have a prize in your hand, and it certainly has taken a lot of effort, I have to say, and I want to thank Karthik and the rest. So we should probably, we should conform to custom. But I'm sure the publisher Sage will also be very happy that we have this photograph. So I want to thank everybody who participated, and thank you.
I get to keep this?
You get to keep it.
Okay.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Elliot.